I'm so delighted to be interviewing you today, Hugh, having a conversation. I mean, I feel like I'm interviewing at least 2 or 3 men, not just one man, with your expertise in wine and trees. You've been star on Desert Island Discs. You're a handy jazz trumpetist, once upon a time, playing with Sharky Banana and the Kings of Dixieland.
Oh, yeah. We all know him, don't we?
In New Orleans. You've been described as a pluviophile, a vulgarisateur, and a necrophiliac, but more about that later.
Your Greek's at fault there, right?
But let's start with the early years. Tell us how it all began, I believe, at Cambridge.
It being my drinking habit.
Yes.
In that sense, yes. I mean, it became an interest more than just a habit at Cambridge, because I had this wonderful roommate who was still a friend. I mean, the poor man became a stockbroker after that, but it was too bad. One evening, I was pretending to work in our mutual rooms at King's College, and he came in quite frisky with his black tie on very late at night, and he said, "Hugh, you ought to taste these. You have to taste this and then taste this." 2 glasses of red wine, which I wanted to oblige. So I did, and he said, "What do you think?" And I said, "Well, I don't know, this one's jolly good," I said, "and that one it's okay, but this one's jolly good." Yes, he said, "Isn't that interesting? Because they come from the same hillside within 200 yards of each other, and this one always produces great wine and this one doesn't." And they were Burgundies, and one was a Grand Cru Vin Romney, the other was not. And I thought, well, that is, followed up the thought. It is interesting. Why can there be such different products from virtually the same place? And it comes down to the soil. And I didn't know that, but I started to learn about it. It made me interested. So that was phase 1 of my drinking life.
And you wrote in this wonderful memoir. So Hugh has just re-released his original memoir called A Life Uncorked, and it's now been updated, The Life and Wines of Hugh Johnson, and you'll be, I hope, signing copies of this later today.
All good bookshops.
You write in your memoir, "I have a perpetual horror of being buttonholed to discuss technicalities by a nerdy wine buff in the company of people who are not."
Well, who wouldn't have a horror of that under any circumstances?
So I have a similar horror of interviewing a global wine expert in front of nerdy wine buffs. So.
Well, you can talk about wine. You don't have to talk about wine at all. You can just neck it, as a horrible expression is. But
what is
you
it?
You can talk about it without using nerdy terms, just in language.
But you've written this amazing tome, The Story of Wine. On the front cover is a sort of picture of a bacchanalian frenzy with sort of semi-clad men and women having fun. Is that your ideal outcome? I mean, why do you drink wine? What's your motive?
It's not encouraged anymore. They're sort of stripping off and.
What fascinates you though about it?
Why did wine become popular in the first place? Because it gives you a lovely feeling, and good wine tastes good too. But it's the trip into the other world which got it going. I mean, when wine was discovered at some point, and where was this funny fluid that appeared? Must have been by mistake. I mean, nobody intended to do it. So somehow a bunch of grapes fermented, and somebody tasted the result, and they didn't think it was delicious. They just felt funny afterwards, and they thought. And when they woke up, they found that it wasn't the sort of fatal poison that they suspected in the first place. They quickly recovered, and they thought, well, let's try that again. So this is how the wine industry got off its feet, obviously. I was just saying that you can talk about wine without being nerdy, without understanding alcoholic fermentation or anything like that, because you can talk about it in whatever language appeals to you. And I like to me, different wines can be like different people. And not just young and old, but male and female. And I was trying to think of wine I saw described as between bride and matron. So I want to get this right because it was rather hot stuff. With softening features but growing guile. That describes the wine beautifully to me.
Wonderful. You talk about wines telling stories, and I think you said great wines don't make statements; they pose questions.
That's great wines.
Right.
Yes.
Right. What are the questions that have maintained your interest for 6 decades?
Well, it's like question A at the beginning when Adrian came into my room. You know, how funny. They look alike. They smell quite different. They are a different experience. You know, and so how come? And great wines to me, and when I say a great wine, one very rarely, frankly, drinks a wine that I think is worth using the word great and comparing it with art, and I shamelessly do. It's a different kind of experience. It's an aesthetic experience, and it opens up vistas of sensation that don't exist otherwise. It just brings it to you. And the thing about it is that wine is, wine is the only comestible, the only good, any I can think of, which encapsulates a certain place at a certain time and a certain person. The maker of the wine did it at a certain place that year when he did it. And all those memories are in the wine. It won't happen with industrial wine, obviously, but if it's made in the old-fashioned way by a farmer in his field and his own cellar and everything else, that moment in time and that place is encapsulated. Now I want to just, shall I encapsulate it for you, Colin?
Mm. I
was once lucky enough to be given, hold on, a wine of the year 1540. 1540, I mean, that was before Shakespeare was born, and this wine was still alive by some miracle. And I tasted it when I was a young man, but the memory is still very, very fresh. And it struck me as I swallowed this sticky drop, which was not as good as it had been, I dare say. I thought, that is incredible. I have swallowed something that was ripened by the sun of the summer more than 400 years ago. Well, that's wine. It's nothing else, I can tell you. Only wine can do that. So to me, there is this something, almost magical about that.
You're famous for your powers of description, Hugh, and you're first and foremost a writer. And there's a wonderful line in the first sentence of your first book where you say, "Think for a moment of an almost paper-white glass of liquid, just shot with greeny gold, just tart on your tongue, full of wildflower scents and spring water freshness. And think of a burnt umber fluid as smooth as syrup in the glass, as fat as butter to smell, and sea-deep with strange flavours, both a wine."
I hope you almost tasted those two.
You clearly prefer words to numbers. Do you have anything to say about Robert Parker's system of scoring wines out of 100?
You'll have to find my off button when I start on this. Yeah, the idea of scoring wines arose with the American critic Robert Parker. He's become world famous as a result. So in wine journalism and in wine magazines and that kind of thing, it is now assumed that you're prepared to say this wine is an 85 or a 96 or something like that, which is complete balls, obviously. The wine is nothing of the kind. And try that system on The Marriage of Figaro, or The Portrait of the Doge, or Keats' Ode on a Grecian Aunt, or just try it to anything you admire and think how much you get out of 100. what do you call it? The whole concept of marking quality, in aesthetic quality, in a score like that, it raises so many questions. I mean, it pretends that there is an objective judgment on anything which is a pleasure. So there isn't, and so it's more than a pity to me that this has become completely built into the wine business these days, and any wine merchant will tell you, oh, this one's a 94. There was a joke in the New Yorker, Jono, where a chap had bought a bottle at some liquor store, and he came back and he said, this is complete rubbish. You got to take it back. But Parker gave it a 90. Oh, I'll take the case.
So what are your favourite metaphors for describing wine then? I mean, do you ever resort to musical metaphors? You know, Bach, Mozart,
Yeah.
Sharky Banana, perhaps?
Yes. No, I have, in sort of fits of madness, tried to compare wines with different composers or different jazz musicians. I mean, there could be a sort of, there could be a wine that was like a Dizzy Gillespie solo, sort of really all over the place. Why not? But, you know, that's what writers do. They pick among the available material and they find a simile or a metaphor. And it's not really like that, but one thing reminds you of the other. That's how we write.
Let's talk about fizz. In your latest memoir, you write, how to define the champagne flavour. I start with apple pie. The tart, sweet flavour of apples is inherent in a young champagne, but mature champagne can evoke the magic moment of walking into a patisserie. So tell us, Hugh, we're all Brexiteers now, reluctant or otherwise. Can us Brits take the credit for putting the bubbles into French bubbly?
Well, yes, in a way we can. I mean, the history is a bit vague at this stage. We're talking about the 17th century. But there's a reasonable argument for saying that champagne, which was a very prestigious wine before it became bubbly at all, it was a sort of northern, it was when the Flemish wanted a Burgundy of their own, so they planted the grapes that belong in Burgundy up in Flanders, or it was in fact in Champagne in those days. And the wine wasn't frightfully good, but it sold well. It had the right flavors, and it was very acid because it comes from too far north to ripen Burgundy grapes, really. It had a market, and it became very fashionable. And at the restoration of Charles II had been having a marvelous time in Paris, and then he was obliged to come back and be King of England. And he brought with him a few of the likely lads who had kept him company. And one or two of them were, as you can imagine, landowners, and one was a chap called Saint-Evremont. And he was a landowner in Champagne, and he wanted people to buy his wine. So it became rather fashionable. Incidentally, Charles wanted to find a title for him, you see, in London. Mm-hmm. And so he made him the governor of Duck Island. If you know St. James's Park, Duck Island is the little island at the end of the lake by Whitehall. So he had that distinction. But anyway, he sold his wine very successfully to the grandees of London at the time, and the Marquis of Salisbury, and who were Lord Chandos and so on. They were going up to buy barrels of this wine. But in those days, wine was not sold in bottle; it was sold in barrel. You cannot have a barrel of fizzy champagne. I mean, just bang, it can't exist. It has to be bottled to become fizzy. So this was almost by accident that his lordship said to his butler, look, I bought a barrel of this marvelous stuff from France. I want you to bottle it for me. Bound in his own cellars. And so he bottled it, and the corks all popped out. But this wine is fizzy, it's fermenting. And his lordship said, well, tie the corks on then, for heaven's sake, man. Use a bit of string, you know. Which he did. And then his lordship later said, perhaps, 6 months later, he said, oh, wine that was, go on, the wine that we had to tie the corks, we ought to try it. Is it any good? So cork popped out, wine dropped into glass, tasted it. Oh my goodness, what's this? It was champagne. It had those amazing qualities that only champagne has. It sort of, invigorating is one word for it.
And the British, we had stronger glass, didn't we, for some reason?
Yes, yes, I mean, it turned out that a normal bottle, as used in most places, if you tied the cork on the bottle, there was a good chance the bottle would have burst. There'd be splinters everywhere. But the glassworks that were being made using tine coal,
right,
made darker and stronger glass. And this was really coincidence. It was a marvellous chap called, never mind his name, there are too many stories to tell. One of the first men to have a patent, buy a patent from the king to use tine coal for a glassworks. He was called Sir Kenelm Digby, and there were he was a pirate, he was all sorts of jolly things as well. But he was very interested in cider. He had cider orchards, and he used these bottles that were stronger and darker for his cider, and it had the champagne effect. So, in other words, the first champagne to become fizzy must have been in this country, because in France they didn't have the bottles.
Wow, and we're talking 1690s, are we? Or?
Yes, the end of the 17th century. But as soon as the French tasted it, they wanted the bottles and they went mad.
But apparently Dom Perignon, the original Dom Perignon, didn't like bubbles. Is that true?
Well, apparently. No, Dom Perignon was a very famous figure, and one of the best champagnes is named after him. He was the treasurer of a Benedictine abbey in the Champagne vineyards. And his business was to make the best wine he could and to sell it at a high price. But he had no idea that it should be bubbly, and it wasn't to start with. So he was getting high prices for the still wine, and then along came this crazy British idea. And to start with, he said, I don't want bubbles. I can't taste the wine properly if it's fizzy.
You said when you're tasting champagne, your mouth feels like the inside of a washing machine.
It can do. It can do, because professional wine tasters have very strange habits. They start by looking at the colour of the wine, and they give it a big sniff, and then take a sip, and then go rattle it round with their tongues and sip air through it. Pretty revolting performance, but if it's champagne you're tasting, you quickly choke, because it becomes, as I said, like a washing machine inside your mouth. So a different technique is needed for champagne, and one day I'll discover what it is, I expect.
Tell us about British fizz and the British wine industry.
I'm going to correct you. I'm
sorry. English, sorry.
English.
Right, there's no Welsh champagne yet.
Yeah, there is, and you could call that British, yes.
Right.
No, in the trade, British wine has always been not wine at all, but something made with concentrated grape must from Cyprus or somewhere in the Empire, you see.
Foul, then, really.
And then fermented in Slough.
Good job you didn't say Southend. We are in Essex.
So English wine is wine made of grapes grown in England.
Right.
And it is turning out, just recently we have been discovering how good it could be. And you'll be very pleased to hear that Essex is one of the very blessed places to grow the grapes. This, as we all know, this is one of the driest and sunniest counties. It's always had a great name for fruit growing. I mean, think where Elsenham, just down there, and Tiptree, just down there. You can ripen fruit very well, and so that includes grapes. And very, very good wine grapes are now being grown in lots of places. Danbury is getting a great reputation for them. And it's not the only place. Gosh, they're being grown all over the south of England. But it's encouraging to know that it's as near home as this. So very, very good wines are being made by, I would say, probably 50 or 60 different companies, nearly all family businesses. And when they're tasted with champagne, in comparison, they're very distinctly different. It's not like an imitation of exactly the same thing. Although the grapes we use are exactly the same grapes, the Chardonnay, the Pinot Noir, the Pinot Meunier. But English fizz has a sort of lightness, and people compare it with apples in an orchard, sort of brightness and freshness of taste, which is becoming highly fashionable. And now we're English winemakers are getting the same price as champagne makers. Quite right, too.
So Essex is the new Epernay.
If we can find a Dom Perignon, it will be.
Tell us, why has England become successful as a wine-growing nation? Is it to do with climate change? Is it just because we're a bit slow to catch on, or is it?
Well, climate change obviously helps. We've obviously had much warmer, better summers than before. The main thing is the confidence, really, because when people started tentatively to plant wine grapes in England, they all thought, well, is it warm enough? Will they ripen? This is a bit marginal. So they went to the other marginal grape-growing country, which is Germany, and they got advice from German boffins who said, we must try this grape called the Reichensteiner, which is specially bred for cool climates and things, and they did, and nobody wanted the results. But then people got a bit more perky about it and said, well, what we need to do is to plant the best grapes, not just the easy ones. Right, what are they? Pinot Noir, number 1. Chardonnay, number 2. That's what they use in Champagne. It didn't actually work brilliantly to start with. We had to find the best places to plant them as well, which is south-facing slopes, chalk soil, and everyone said, well, marvellous, we've got the same chalk soil as Champagne, which is true up to a point. The North Downs and the South Downs are the very same kind of chalk that you get in Champagne. So, right, you've got the right soil, similar climate's getting warmer, right grapes. The results began to come right, really seriously right. So, one can go too far about soil and things like that, because nowadays in England people are growing very good grapes on chalk, green sand, Thames Valley clay, all sorts of places, making lovely wine. So I think the jury's out, but all the signs are that although it will never be cheap, English wine can be as good as any.
Let's talk about the changing culture of wine briefly. We also need to get on to trees and gardens at some point. But this week, your old college raised over £1.3 million auctioning off some of its Burgundies at Christie's, including a case of Grand Cru Echezeaux, 1999, made by Henri Jaillet, that fetched £100,000 for one
late
case.
Henri Jaillet. Yes, that's one of the reasons why. He was a very, very great winemaker, sort of champion of Burgundy.
Right.
And then sadly died rather young.
Oh.
And so the wines that he made have got a very, very special cachet. But I was amazed by the price. But it's collectors.
Right.
I do beg your pardon.
But it's great. It must be great technique. Are techniques improving, or is it just becoming a commodity?
Well, at one level, it is just becoming a commodity. But the best vineyards in Burgundy, as I was saying earlier, have got incredible character that is specific to this little plot of land. And you get the right man and the right plot and the right year, and limited supply. This is the great thing. Rarity is what puts the price up.
So that particularity in Burgundy is fetching more money than the great clarets, then, is it?
Well, the thing about Burgundy is there's so much less of it. Bordeaux is a massive region, and even one of the absolute top chateaux like Lafite or Latour produces 100,000 cases of wine.
Right.
But in Burgundy, you're lucky to get one case from this particular plot. So obviously that's where the price comes from. Yeah.
And I guess the impact of China and other emerging markets, India, has that had
yes,
impact?
I mean, it's perfectly true. The Chinese have bought into the Bordeaux in a big way. But funnily enough, they don't buy the top growths, or very little. I was there a few years ago sort of investigating why is it that the Chinese have got such a thing about Bordeaux and which particular Bordeaux, you see. And wherever I went, I saw wines labelled Lafite, Chateau Lafite, which, it is, I mean, they produce it in a factory, and it didn't matter to them what the wine was. They could call it by the grandest name. So I said to a Chinese friend, I said, why is it Lafite that you pick on rather than Latour, which is a chateau that I know particularly well, or Chateau Margaux, or other world-famous names? Oh, he said, well, we all know what fit means. It means you're fit.
You're right. I was thumbing through your pocket wine book, and there's a very famous vintage, isn't there? The Romane Conti. And you wrote, most celebrated Grand Cru in Burgundy, gold dust on fabulous form. And then you write, but beware geeks bringing fake gifts. What's all that about? Was it?
Where do you find that?
It's that. I'm sorry, I put you on the spot here. Is it something to do with wine?
I've been sloppy about proofreading recently.
I know you're famous for putting jokes.
Oh, I see. Fake gifts, yes.
Fake gifts.
Well, yeah, that's because it is so imitated.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, that is wine that starts off on import at something like £3,000 a bottle.
Right.
So wouldn't people fake it? I mean, the fake business is very serious.
Right. Well, who are the best fakers then?
Probably
be telling.
Probably the Chinese. I don't know.
We ought to move on. I feel a little bit like sort of Willy Wonka hustling my guests through the chocolate factory of your mind at top speed. There's so many wonderful rooms to explore in so little time. But on to gardening and trees. Sue Stewart-Smith this morning referred to gardening. She was on first. She referred to gardening as a non-verbal experience. But for you, it seems to be quite the opposite, really. It means that just two of your wonderful publications. This is The World of Trees, which is a really fantastic sort of encyclopedic volume. This is your 10 years out of your 4 decades of writing as trad, your nom de plume, or nom de bloom, you could say. Tell us, actually, what I'd love you to do would be to read some of your introduction. Would you mind? It's such a beautiful introduction, and it just shows the breadth of Hugh's writing ability.
Oh, yes. The first garden I remember had all the prescribed qualities of a great design: unity, proportion, ecological soundness, and fitness for purpose. My father made it on half an acre by the sea, using a single species, the bramble. The tip of Chelsea Bill in the centre of England's south coast was where, at least in the apprehension of the locals, Hitler planned to step ashore. Our summer house there was commandeered for the war years. Giant cubes of concrete were put along the beach at the bottom of the garden and miles of barbed wire. I don't know what the garden contained in 1939, the year I was born, but by 1946, when we got our house back from the army, the answer was brambles. Was there a purple lilac in April? Perhaps one. One or two twiggy tamarisks were a dowdy pink. Otherwise, the whole plot, a rectangle with a beech at the bottom and the house at the top, was a thicket of brambles 5 feet high. Fuel was rationed and time was short. My father took the positive line. He saw plant material rather than weeds. He wouldn't have recognized such designer's jargon, but he recognized an opportunity. He spent his weekends with his bagging hook, the Sussex sickle, carving his plant material into the streets around his city office. You had Watling Street, Queen Victoria Street, Bow Lane, Bread Street. Queen Victoria Street led obliquely down to the blocks of the beach where Father gave me £0.50 for learning to swim. But so that was a pattern. That was a bramble garden. And I'm glad you remember that. I love it.
Well, it's a lovely description. And I mean, your father was obviously a great influence, but what sort of triggered your love of trees and gardening?
Well, frustration, actually. Frustration with my father, funnily enough. Because we moved to a house on the North Downs in Kent, led straight out onto the downland. And we actually... my father owned a field at the bottom, which he used to let out for grazing. And I used to look at it when I was in my teenage years and look at it and think, oh, I wish there were some trees in that field. Why I just particularly love trees, I'll never know. But it would have been greatly improved by some trees. So I'm afraid to say that the very year that my father died, I thought, right, in his memory, I'm going to plant lots of trees. And that's what I did. Those are the first trees I planted in anger, and I've gone on ever since. I've now planted many thousands of trees. You
write in this book, The World of Trees, my aim was to bring these into focus for everyone like myself who is aware of trees, loved trees, but in a way so vague that it now seems to me quite shameful. It was the personal account of a writer who found in trees a new point of contact with creation, a source of wonder and satisfaction, a hobby, a passion, an obsession for life. It has led me to travel, to read, to talk with people similarly afflicted in a lifetime voyage of discovery. Tell us where trees have taken you on your travels. Are there any particularly memorable places?
Well, that book, the big book you held up, got me moving. Because when I wrote the World Atlas of Wine about 50 years ago, and it was happy to say, a big success. And so James Mitchell, my publisher, came along and he said, Hugh, that was terrific. What's your next act? And I said, trees. And he said, cheese, oh, that's great. Cheese and wine, they go perfectly together. And I said, no, T-R. He said, but man, trees, he said, they're not a consumer subject. However, we found a sponsor, a big paper company, and we produced the book, and I'm proud to say that we induced them to sponsor the book by offering them a royalty, and within a couple of years they'd got their money back. So it was a bit more consumer than James thought.
I confess I haven't read it from cover to cover, but it did fall open at the monkey puzzles clinging to the side of a volcano in Chile.
Yes.
I mean, it's absolutely extraordinary. And your description is so wonderful. You say the biggest, like, scaly parasols, their progeny clustering around, gesticulating with spindly limbs. The smallest were comically childlike, some meek and tidy, some waving their fists, scampering, it seemed, through the drifts. I don't think I've ever read anyone write about trees shaking their fists before, but it's a really wonderful book. There's the photo of the monkey puzzles.
Well, that book I wrote as a sort of sequel to the World Atlas of Wine, almost. It came out in 1972. And then 40 years later, I thought, gosh, do you know, I actually know something about trees now. Why didn't I do it again?
Yeah.
And so I did a second edition, and it has the great advantage that I did know something about what I was saying.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We're nearly out of time. There was one question I wanted to ask you, which because you're the encyclopedist, you know everything, and I've thought of one question that maybe you might not know the answer to, so I'm going to try you out. Anyway, you write when you're gardening that when you weed, you award yourself 1 point if you can remember the common name of a weed, 2 points if you can remember the Latin name of a weed. In my youth, I spent 6 years in the Brigade of Gurkhas and spent a year of that in Nepal and went rhododendron hunting in the east of Nepal on one memorable trek. And I wondered if you knew what the Nepali for rhododendron was.
It wouldn't be weed, would it?
No. It's lali grass.
Lali grass.
That's got to be worth 3 points, isn't it?
Oh gosh, yes. No, more than that. Yeah.
And they crushed the petals into a lovely red juice and serve it. You know, you can buy it on the side of the street.
To drink?
Yeah, to drink. Yeah.
Oh, I'd feel rather nervous about drinking rhododendron juice.
Let's take some questions quickly. I'm sure there are people in the audience dying to ask Hugh something about. Okay, can we get a microphone to the lady on the right?
Thank you so much for your talk. I absolutely adore trees, and I love the monkey puzzle. It was amazing you brought that one up. I remember the first time I ever saw one. Can you please tell us your favorite tree, or one that you're the most fond of, and why?
Well, it's an oak. It's bound to be an oak. I mean, the oak is our greatest tree in every way. Who would disagree that the oak is our greatest tree? There we are. You see. Point proven. Individual oaks, majestic, craggy old things in Windsor or Richmond Park, that kind of thing. There are some great old oaks around here. But even as young trees, I just love everything about an oak is so full of personality. It doesn't grow upwards in a straight line like most trees. It has buds. If you look at an oak twig, it's got whole mass of little buds saying, I'm up for it, and another one saying, I'm up for it. So it grows that way, and so its branches go craggily, and it spreads, and this is why it's fantastic, long-lasting timber, as we all know. But it also grows in convenient shapes for shipbuilding. And when they were building the ships of the Royal Navy, they needed pieces of timber that were like that, with angles, right angles and other angles that were incredibly strong because they'd grown that way. So a shipwright would go around a forest and say, I'll have that tree, I'll have that tree, and he could see the ship up there in the sky in the tree. That's not number one reason for loving them, but for respecting them and knowing how valuable they are, absolutely. I love planting oaks.
Oh, gentleman at the back.
Yes, what are the possibilities of growing quality red wine in this country? And if there are, which varieties would you pick?
Well, the answer is Pinot Noir, because it's a fairly early ripening grape. It makes fabulous wine, and it's already proven in this country that you can make jolly good wine with it. I mean, in the right spot. So, although it is a vital ingredient for the champagne blend, the classic champagne blend for the flavor, it is also our best chance of making good red wine. There are new hybrid grapes that are okay. You can make red wine with them, but are not of any special quality or interest. So I think the answer is always Pinot Noir.
Any other questions? Yes, the lady in the front.
Could you tell me your top 3 meals of all time?
Ooh, 3 meals. 3?
Or just one? I don't
Breakfast,
want to
lunch and tea. So full English, salmon and cucumber, and roast chicken.
Any more questions? Oh, the lady on the left here, please. Thank you.
Do you ever find that you've rated a wine really highly and it's been because you've just been in a really happy mood?
Have you ever rated a wine highly just because you've been in a happy mood?
Oh, I dare say, yes, yeah. Oh, yes. In the right place at the right time with the right person, you bet. I mean, this is why Provençal rosé is so popular, because everyone remembers the pleasure of being in Provence. I mean, the fact that it tastes of nothing is relevant.
Oh, the gentleman at the front. We've got time for one more. Last question.
Hi, Hugh. I met you 12 years ago at your house, and since then I planted a vineyard about a mile away. And I tried to give you a bottle, but I was a little squirt, so you weren't that interested. But I'm glad to hear that you thought it's got a lot better, and we're doing okay. But as well as red wine, what else do you think we should be doing? What about Riesling, Pinot Gris? What other areas do you think we should be looking at?
There's a greater variety of possible white grapes for England than red, no doubt. Well, there are just more white varieties anyway than red varieties. So Riesling, I reckon, is a non-starter because it's a late ripener. You know, we want something. Problem with this is where climate change is helping us here, because a vine needs 100 days, give or take, between its flowering and ripening the grapes. Well, if the flowering is late because spring is late, then the ripening is going to be late, and by that time it'll have started to rain, and it's October and so on. So you need a vine that flowers pretty early, and there are lots, but the Riesling is not one of them, sadly. I think there are experiments being made all over, and most of the wine that's succeeding in the market here is made of a grape called Bacchus, which is a hybrid designed specially for a climate like ours, and it appeals to people who like Sauvignon Blanc, the sort of kiwi flavor. It's a bit like that. It doesn't interest me because there are so many better alternatives. I mean, if you want a really good value standard white wine, which from not too far away, I'd go to Muscadet. Muscadet, everyone knows the name, nobody bothers to drink it because it's not sort of rated as something amazing. But a good bottle of Muscadet is an amazing value for money and very available. So,
Great.
Good luck.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that last tip, Hugh. I'll be heading down to the wine merchant to get some Muscadet. And I think it's time now for one of your favourite meals of the day, probably. So, thank you very much for speaking to us this morning and sharing some of your wisdom.
Thank you for your questions.
It's been a great pleasure. Ladies and gentlemen, Hugh Johnson.